Report on the phone. It is a pleasure to welcome to the program Professor of History at the New School for Social Research and Eugene Lang College, author of A Brief History of Fascist Lies, Professor Federico Finchelstein. Welcome to the program.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
I want to just start with, you know, I should say you obviously you write about fascism quite a bit from a historical perspective. Your last book, Fascism to Populism. But give me a sense of what it is, particularly in this topic of fascist lies. What inspired you to write this book? I'm interested, you know, more or less, I guess, like in your personal history of growing up under a I guess, arguably a fascist regime.
Well, I mean, there are different answers to that question. One dimension, of course, is the biographical one. The first 10 years of my life, I live under a dictatorship that was inspired in a history of fascist ideas. And this dictatorship decided that people that did not think the way the generals wanted them to think were regarded as terrorists, and basically they were kidnapped, tortured, and eventually disappeared, quote unquote, which is to say that these people were killed without anyone knowing about their whereabouts. Now, this dictatorship did in Argentina the dirty war, and by what is interesting is that in fact the irony or the contradiction was that these dictators were calling members of the opposition terrorists, but in fact they turned the state into a terrorist actor. So that's why historians of Argentina, we talk about the state terrorism. Now, of course, this is very worrisome when you see the same kind of language coming from the White House.
Let's talk about how you started off the your book. You had 3 quotes. And I have to say, at the very least, this one, you must believe me because I have the habit. It is in my system of my life of always and everywhere saying the truth. That sounds like Donald Trump in many respects. But of course, that was not the Trump quote that you used. That was one from Mussolini. So you had a quote from Trump, Hitler, and Mussolini. What is the difference between the lies that a fascist or would-be fascist tells and just the lies that politicians, broadly speaking, tell?
Yes, I mean, lies are part of politics. As you know, I mean, all politicians lie at one point. But the big difference between a fascist and other types of politicians is not only that they lie more, so here we have a big difference of quantity, but a qualitative difference as well, which is that they either believe their lies or they believe that ultimately their lies are at the service of a larger transcendental truth, which is the truth that emanates from the cult-like leader. So basically, I mean, and going back to your previous question, I was always interested, both for personal reasons, biographical reasons, as well as you know, scholarly reasons, to understand why people believe in these lies. This is not only about the technique of propaganda, but rather that this propaganda is believed by many. So what people, why people will find meaning in these lies, and eventually they will be willing to die or even kill for them. So there is a kind of a very problematic outcome of this form of lying that we saw in the past with Hitler and Mussolini, and I'm afraid we are seeing now with Donald Trump, which is that by denying facts, by denying science, and denying reality, they change reality, and people die as a consequence of this. I mean, from not wearing masks to putting people in concentration camps.
Give us maybe I should have started with this, but give us a definition of fascism. So when we're talking about a fascist leader, and you know, I mean, there's obviously a leap between Hitler, Mussolini, and then Trump. But give us a definition of what fascism, what a fascist leader is.
Yes, and by the way, I would like to stress the fact that I don't think Trump is a fascist yet. Trump, and I will go back to this very soon before I will answer your question, but Trump, I mean, is a populist leader that would like to be in a fascist situation, but he's not. And that depends, of course, on the rest of us to, if we, to stop that. Now, going back to your question, what is fascism? I mean, fascism is an ideology and a form of government that always stands for putting violence and the glorification of violence, racism, and this type of life at the center of its politics. And in addition to that, and last but not least, fascism always a form of dictatorship. So it's an extreme radical extreme right ideology that proposes dictatorship and persecutes those that either behave, think, or simply are different to what the fascists regard as a homogeneous people.
So, I mean, so in the context of Trump, obviously he's not a dictator. So that is a major element. But he has centered, I think it's fair to say, to some extent, I mean, to a significant extent, race and racism in his leadership. I mean, he ascended in the Republican Party as attacking the, basically calling Barack Obama, the other, as it were, because he was an alien who was not born in this country, shouldn't have been president. And certainly he has nibbled at the edges on promoting violence at various times. And so it's really just sort of, it is his inability to have assumed and to concentrate power. Is that basically what keeps him within the realm of just being a right-wing populist?
Yes, but I mean, I think you are absolutely right also in stressing what makes Trump close to the fascists as well. I mean, because, in my previous book, From Fascism to Populism, I explained how after 1945, when fascism was defeated, many dictators and many fascists decided or realized that that kind of politics, meaning putting racism at the center of politics, putting violence at the top, and certainly, wishing for dictatorship to be, was toxic in the post-war war. So these dictators, these fascists, as opposed to what the fascists did before, which is, as you know, Hitler and Mussolini used democratic means to destroy democracy from within. So these populists, people like Juan Perón in Argentina or Getulio Vargas in Brazil, after 45, they were dictators. And as opposed to what the fascists did, destroying democracy from within, these dictators destroyed the dictatorship from within in order to create new electoral democracies. They carry on key elements of fascism, but also they left behind three, or I would say four key elements. And these elements were the glorification of violence, racism being at the center of politics, as you just mentioned, the technique of lying, which was rather typical of fascism, and of course, dictatorship. Now, that was the history of populism until recently, when people like Trump emerged. Because, from left to right, people like the Kirchners in Argentina, Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, but also right-wingers like Fernando Collor de Mello in Brazil or Silvio Berlusconi in Italy, they kind of, as right-wing as they were, they never put racism at the center. And occasionally, these people were racist, occasionally they were violent, but they were not as, let's say, pro-dictatorship, pro-violence, and pro-racism as the fascists were. Now, what happens is that we see a change in the history of populism because with people like Trump, with people like Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil, with people like Viktor Orban in Hungary, or even Narendra Modi in India, what we see is that populism is going back to some key elements that earlier populists, throughout the 20th century have left behind. So we see a return in populism to key elements of fascism. As you rightly point out, Trump started his campaign with racism. We should remember that he went down his kind of golden stairs in his Trump Tower, and he accused Mexicans of being rapists. He started with a racist statement. So This used to be toxic in politics. Early populists will see that this was problematic. Racist populists like George Wallace never made it into the presidency because of this. And Trump basically showed that that in a way racism and violence were useful again for populists. Now, the result of that is that then we see a populism that is very close to fascism. It is violence. It is extremely violent in terms of its glorification and eventually in its practice. It is extremely racist. It lies like the fascists, and yet it lacks the dictatorial dimension. So we are not seeing full-fledged fascism yet. And as I said, it depends on the rest of us to stop this. Meaning, Trump would like to be a fascist, but it's unclear he will be able to.
And it, who knows who's going to adopt his mantle after he is gone. But since you brought up your earlier book, I just want to talk about like one thing that from your earlier work that I thought was pretty interesting and relevant here is that U.S. populism before 1920. In that book, you break it down into three basic eras of populism and fascism and pre-1920, essentially in between 1920 or 1918 and 1945, and then post-45, which you just sort of touched on. But your discussion of populism in that book was a right-wing, a populism that starts amongst like, farmers and small producers. But when it gains strength and becomes part of the government, there is a reconciliation between these small producers and corporate and finance capital. Can you just talk about that a little bit? Because, the idea of we've just had a left-wing populist movement in this country. I think we have a growing one, but one that played out. It did not win in the Democratic primary, but there are some who are talking about the similarities between left-wing and right-wing populism. And I'm curious as to the extent that they exist, if you could talk about those, but also those key differences.
Yes, I think, in my own approach, I stress the fact that when I say there are authoritarian elements in populism that also include left populism, I'm referring particularly to two ideas. One is the cult of the leader. Because even, in populism and modern populism after 45 carried that from fascism, you see the idea that rather than being a representative of the people, the leader of a populist movement is the one that decides for us. In a way, he's not only, and generally was a he, in terms of reaching power, he's not only our representative, but he presents himself as the personification of the people. So thereby, whoever is against the leader is an enemy of the people. Now, the point is that, and I will return to this issue of what are still the key differences between left-wing populism and right-wing populism. But let me refer to the recent Democratic primary, because I don't think someone like Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren were populist. In the U.S., generally, there is the tendency to somehow conflate popular demands and actors or politicians that respond to those political demands with populism as such. Populism also involves the idea of a leader that is best than the rest of us, and we should just sit in the back seat and do nothing. So I don't think that people like Warren or Sanders or Ocasio-Cortez, among many, represent that populism. They are basically left-wing politicians that represent popular demands. So populism is something else. It is the idea that not only they represent popular demands, but rather they know what popular demands are even better than the rest of us. So there is an idea of, in a way, switching from representation to delegation. We delegate all power on these leaders. Now, but then we see this populism of the left in other situations and countries. For example, the case of Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, or the case of the Kirchners in Argentina. These were politicians that generally stood for, sometimes, actually, not all the time, but generally stood for sometimes progressive measures, but at the same time, they were authoritarian and vertical in the sense that they believe whoever was against these ideas that they had was a member of or an enemy of the people. So we don't see at all that in people like Sanders. So I think it's misleading to call him a populist in terms of my own, interpretation. Meaning, I have a very technical and scholarly notion of populism, of course.
Fair enough.
Now, going back to the differences is that once you have populists, let's say someone very authoritarian populist, which sometimes will be presented as being on the left, such as the former Venezuelan president Hugo Chavez. So Chavez still, even if he was authoritarian, there were many, let's say there were important differences between, let's say, this sort of left-wing populism and the current right-wing populism. Because the idea, in a way, starts with the same premise. The idea that whoever stands with the leader, that is the people, or those are the people, and whoever is against is the anti-people. So you see this, right?
Yeah.
But in the left-wing version of populism, basically what you have is that this is a place that can change suddenly, and it relies on political identification, on what you think politically. It doesn't matter, what color your skin is, or other types of, thoughts or behavior. So it's really a political notion of the people, the authoritarian notion of the people that the leader has, in the sense that if you are with him, you are with the people. If you are against, you are against the people. So in that sense, the current populism of the right, such as Trump or Bolsonaro in Brazil, they adopt a more, if you will, more fascist version of this. Because for them, the people are not only, those citizens that agree with them, but also they conflate that notion of the people, which is rather traditional and rather extended in the history of politics, meaning the people are those that have a certain types of ideas. That's it, right?
Yeah.
But they conflate that with what the fascists did, which is a more an ethnic/religious notion of the people.
Okay.
So which are the base? Which are the real base? The real people for Trump? Well, they are white Americans that are also Christian. And the same you can see in Hungary, the same you can see in Brazil. And this is not really like the typical populist version of who the people are.
So,
I mean, in a non-populist version, the people are all of us, right? It doesn't matter whether we disagree with each other, we are all the people. For populists, let's say before Trump, the people are those that identify with the leader. After Trump or with Trump, the people are those that identify with the leader, but generally the real people are those that are white and Christian. So you go back to this fascist ethno-religious notion of the people. This is a kind of mix, right? The fascists did not have the ideas part. It was only who was Aryan and Christian, okay? Whereas for someone like Trump, he mixes this. People that vote for him, but also, people that are white and Christian.
I see. So when we're talking about, so when we're talking about the left populists, it is almost an authoritarianism that is a function of ideology of some kind, and on the right, it is one that is an authoritarianism that is more identitarian, I guess.
Correct.
Okay.
Yes, exactly.
And
exactly.
so, and what about that concept of, because your description of populism sounds very synonymous with authoritarianism. That relationship between the followers and the leader is an authoritarian dynamic.
Yes, but populism has a kind of, there are two sides to the populist coin, let's say, because there is the authoritarianism, but there is something, and let's go back to this idea that populists after 1945 left behind key elements of authoritarianism and fascism. So there are authoritarian ideas, but also they are mixed, conflicted, but also mixed. They are a hybrid because they are mixed with democratic ones. So who is the one that rules? The person that is voted. And that's why populists are obsessed with elections. And that's why in the history of populism, the idea is that you don't have, let's say, a pluralistic idea of the people or who are the majority. So the people become only the majority that agrees with the leader. The minorities in populism, they are delegitimized. They don't have legitimacy because they are not the real people. Now, nothing happens to them in a populist democracy. They are symbolically demonized, but nothing happens. They are not persecuted, and they still have the ability to vote against the leader. Now the leader says, you don't like me, vote me out. The majority voted for me, so if you don't like me, vote me out. If you lose, then you are not the people, but you will keep your rights. Whereas in fascism, there is no thing like that, in the sense that minorities are imprisoned, exiled, and eventually killed. So there is no place for the minority in fascism or dictatorship. And in the populist, let's say, a way of authoritarianism, what you have is a mix. There are, let's say, authoritarian, basically the language is authoritarian, which is bad enough, but the practice is not. And that's why I'm so concerned about someone like Trump, because what you see is that he goes beyond the language. He seems to go back to, to things which were not used, which were not typical of populism, but rather typical of fascism. So we have in Trump a new hybrid in a way, a mix not only of populism and democracy, but a mix of those two with fascism again.
Is it a hybrid, or are we simply, or is it, or from a conceptual standpoint, are we looking at a hybrid, or are we looking at a matter of degree, that you're moving along a spectrum and that you need to go through this part of, to get from place A to place B, or or Z, you're going through some of those other letters in the alphabet, and that's what, in some sense, that's what we're doing. I mean, Trump may not be able to get all the way, but we're heading down a certain path.
Certainly, and as an historian, I really like the way you put it, because this is a process. So at this point, it's a hybrid, but we see, I mean, it's difficult to see which is the end point, but we see that there has been a deterioration of democracy in this country, and Trump's authoritarianism has increased over the years, over days even. So, and certainly, radicalized by the current pandemic, and his ability to downplay important institutions of the state, appropriating them, militarizing politics, and all the things that your listeners know about what the president is doing. So yes, this is we see that he has been trying. We don't see the end point. Hopefully, the end point will be, him losing in elections. But we see that he has been trying to, in a way, depart from, let's say, the more democratic dimensions of populism, and even to some extent depart from some key populist dimensions to turn into a more dictatorial or even fascist situation. He has not been able to do so, and as I said, hopefully he will not be able to do so. So it's hard to say historically whether Trump is a fascist in the making, because we don't know what is going to happen. Historians, we always have hindsight, and we know what is going to happen. At this point, it's a matter of speculation, but certainly we can say, and I can say this as an expert on both fascism and populism, that what we see is that here you have a populist that is really making the populist dimension, certainly the democratic ones, and trying to approach fascism or dictatorship with a fast pace. Again, there are a lot of steps that he will need to take, and I'm not so sure the rest of us will allow him to do so.